Hello and welcome to Kvikmyndapod, an Icelandic cinema podcast. I'm Rob Watts, and together with my good friend Ellie Cawthorne, we journey through the landscape of 21st century Icelandic film. It's 2026 and we're back with a brand new Hlynur Pálmason joint. Remember him? Director of some of our favourite films? Well, his new one, The Love That Remains, is out in UK cinemas on the 13th of March, and so we've reconvened to talk all about it. Tonally and narratively different to his previous feature projects, The Love That Remains documents a year in the life of a family split by divorce. Starring Saga Garðarsdóttir, who you might have spotted in Woman at War and the brilliant TV series Afturelding and Stella Blomqvist, as well as Sverrir Gudnason from Northern Comfort, this film departs from the sweeping epic of Godland and the intense drama of A White White Day, favouring a more photo album-esque collection of interesting moments. Oh, and the director's kids are back. For an incomplete list of where the film is showing, listen on or check the show notes, and bear in mind we do go into spoilers immediately. So if you've now gone away and seen the film, or want to know what happens anyway, please enjoy.
Órafjarri í litlum afskekktum bæ situr 5 manna fjölskylda á samt fjárhundi og nýtur síðbúins kvöldverðar. Þau eru hamingjusöm á að líta, örugg og varin frá hættum heimsins. Móðirinn, hæfileikaríkur listamaður í harki, að vinna að sínum metnaðarfyllstu verkum til þessa.
It's nice. Are they all brown?
Faðirinn úti að afla lífsviðurværis fyrir fjölskylduna á 15.000 tonna togara.
Hugsa þér svo graf. Okay. Tígar?
Börnin njóta þeirra forréttinda að vera frjáls og áhyggjulaus, lifa í sátt og samlyndi við náttúruna, hvað sem það nú þýðir. Það eru engir öfgahægri menn eða morðingjar í þessari mynd. Aðeins venjulegt fólk með venjulegar tilfinningar og venjuleg vandamál.
Píka.
Mér finnst það ekki að fyndið.
Myndin hefur áhuga á hversdagslegum hlutum eins og gönguferðum, hundabaði, snjó, mat, frosinn fisk, góðum stígvélum, ástíðum, háhyrningum, sumarkjól, Jóhönnu af Örk,
Segir að maðurinn aumingi Hulda, ég oftar að berja hann.
húmor, kynlífi eða skort á því, öllu því sem raunverulega skiptir máli. En undir yfirborðinu leynist eitthvað. Eitthvað sem við skiljum ekki, eitthvað fornt, dýrslegt, dularfullt leyndarmál.
Drafst hann?
Þetta nýjasta kvikmynd Hlyns Pálmasonar, Ástin sem eftir er. Ekki láta hana framhjá ykkur fara.
Já, hún að gefa mig putta núna. Við erum að helsa þér líka tilbaka.
Eða gerið það og horfið bara á eitthvað annað.
Hi Ellie.
Hi, Rob.
How's it going? It's been a while.
It has been a while because a lot's been going on, hasn't it?
Sure has. More your end, I would say, but it's been a big year.
Yes, absolutely. So since we last recorded, I have, in fact, had a whole baby, an entire baby.
One whole baby?
Yeah, who's downstairs currently. Hopefully people can't hear her crying too much. But
what's her name?
Her name is Orla, which actually, in some Scandinavian countries, it can be a boy or a girl's name.
That's fascinating. I did not know that. I'd never met an Orla who is
I don't know if it's
a girl.
I don't know if it's an Icelandic name, but if it was, it would probably be a male name.
I'm sure someone can tell us. That's very exciting. And how are you feeling? Can you remember how to do this?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I think we're going to have to find out right now.
Sure, yeah.
Do I still have a brain? Unclear, but we will find out.
I mean, you can definitely talk, 'cause this is a good start. And you did remember the sort of theme of the podcast. It is Iceland. That's good. That's good. This year I moved house. Finally got a house. So I'm now in Chippenham, which is exciting. Was a bit of a big thing, but we're nice and settled. And I'm now recording from a new room, which is soundproofed by a duvet. So, see how that goes.
Always glamorous.
Makeshift is the best way. So yeah, big year. And we're back today because you'll never guess what. Hlynur Pálmason, friend of the pod, he's got a new film and it's being
back.
released in the cinema in the UK.
Yeah. Do you know how many cinemas or where?
I don't know how many cinemas, but enough that people around the country, around the UK, can actually see it. And I will run through a list of the ones I found at the end of the podcast. Because everyone should see this film because it's very cool and it's very different to his other work. But shall I just do a quick synopsis and then we can dive in? I think that's what we normally do. So I should say this is the film The Love That Remains. In Icelandic, that's Ástin sem eftir and that was 2025, although it's now out in 2026. So I've got an iPad now as well. I feel so professional.
All right, boomer.
Synopsis. The Love That Remains tells the story, not that there's any really strong narrative, of a family in rural Iceland who have been split by divorce and are continuing on with their lives. Over the course of a year, we follow Mum Anna, who's an artist struggling for an audience, and Dad Magnus, or Maggie, who's a fisherman living away from the family home and who spends much of his time on board a fishing vessel. Meanwhile, the kids Grímur, Þorgils, and Ida do kid stuff. They talk, play, create, and get into scrapes. Oh, and there's a cute dog called Panda. The title really describes what we see on film, the love that remains within the family and its members after a separation has taken place. How's
Nice. That summed it up to me very nicely. But I would say that kind of representing this film with a plot synopsis is maybe a bit misleading because it's not really plot driven or plot heavy, is it?
It's not, no. I feel like I've used this phrase quite a lot in the past on this podcast, but it is a sort of series of moments. Like I say, it's over the course of a year. And with Pálmason's films, he has this very specific style where we see single static shots, we see the weather changing, the seasons passing, and that is kind of sort of central to this film. And yeah, like there's no real story. We just see glimpses of this family doing stuff over time.
It's almost a kind of like art project or a set of moving photographs, and as you say, moments is the way to think of it.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because what has become clear from some interviews I've read and listened to with the director is that he has an idea, but he's already started filming things before the idea even comes to him.
Oh, really?
So a few years ago, we covered his short film Nest, which was great and actually featured the kids in the film. That
to me feels quite similar to this. It feels like that was maybe, a testing ground for some of the stuff in this film.
Yeah, I think so. And he's even said that filming that, he started thinking about what would the parents be doing while these kids are building the treehouse? What's their story? And that's kind of the genesis of the story for The Love That Remains. But we mentioned the kids there. They're his own kids.
Yeah, I recognise them from their previous projects.
Yeah, so we've seen Ida in everything that he's done. Godland, A White White Day, Nest, and the twins, obviously. But I guess talking about this film as a sort of photo album makes sense because we really focus on this family, and obviously 3 of them are actually related. And it feels really natural when you see them doing their stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, the whole thing is super naturalistic. Actually, I say that, but obviously there's some fantastical elements as well, which come as a bit of a surprise partway through. But yeah, it does have this fly on the wall tone to a lot of it.
Yeah. This film, I guess, if we were to think about it in relation to his other films, we've spoken how it's similar in some of the ways it's shot, but it is stylistically and tonally quite different. It's not the kind of grief-stricken drama of A White White Day. It's not the epic priest drama of Godland. We still see those shots of the epic landscapes of Iceland, but this is far more sort of realistic, mundane. There's comedy, and as you said, there's fantasy elements. What did you make of that? And especially coming from off the back of Godland?
Well, for me, I have to say I do prefer my films generally with a little bit more plot driving them. You probably knew I was going to say this. I mean that I could also say, I do have a 3-month-old baby, 4-month-old baby when I watch this,
Yeah.
which means that my attention span is somewhat decreased. So I do. I mean, everything I've been watching lately has been quite basic, I guess. I haven't watched a lot of really intellectual or art housey stuff.
Give
So
us some examples.
of what I've been watching,
Yeah, please.
Bridgerton,
Yeah.
The Walsh Sisters. Have you seen that? Some kind
No.
of schlocky drama.
Nice.
Malice, starring Jack Whitehall. Basically anything that is campy, soapy, without child death or imminent threat is what I'm after.
Are we talking the kinds of things that, and I hate this, but that streaming platforms intend to be seen with a second device in hand?
Yes, very much this.
Yeah.
I mean, I have been watching this. You Will Judge Me. I've watched the entirety only after 2 a.m. That was my rule, that I could only watch it after that because such brain rot of The Summer I Turned Pretty. So that's the level I've been
Okay.
operating at. But don't worry, I didn't watch this after 2 a.m. I did watch this in the daytime. And it was nice. It was refreshing to watch something that required a bit more attention and a bit more thought and processing, let's say. And it wasn't all handed to you on a plate. But I guess A White Day and Godland do feel more like there was a underlying narrative that's been explored, whereas this feels more like the exploration of a theme or an idea about
Yeah.
family and what's holding a family together.
I think that's true, and I think that is the point of the film. Palmerson has said, like, he just wanted to sort of capture moments, as I've said, and just explore what it might be like for a family to go through this process without sort of examining why it happened and necessarily, people getting into screaming matches and doing the Holy Stenders thing. And it's interesting, I think, because it is for me, it feels like a more personal film. Certainly because it includes his kids. It's quite hard to detach. For me, it's quite hard to detach myself from the fact that those are the director's kids, that the main character or the mother character is an artist.
Yeah, it feels like very much, I mean, not saying that he's gone through a divorce or that's
Which I
exactly
don't believe he has.
what's happening, but it does feel like maybe that might be his kind of family vibe. And it is an interesting vibe because it feels to me, I was thinking about this earlier, how the setup feels kind of like old fashioned, that it's like, latchkey kids of like, right, kids, you just go off, do your own thing, come back later and we'll have dinner. But maybe that's, a rural thing or an Icelandic thing. In the UK, you wouldn't really have kids just allowed to go off and shoot bows and arrows around.
Well, they do say they're not supposed to.
But that kind of freedom and independence feels like something from a bygone age here. But I imagine that that's maybe more the case in Iceland.
Yeah, I think especially because they're in very rural Iceland. I think this was shot in Hlynur Pálmarson's birthplace, Höp, which is in the southeast of Iceland, a place I have visited. And I think the kids basically, when you see them doing the things that they're doing on their own, that is what they would be doing anyway, in a way. Like there just happens to be a camera there. So I find it hard to detach from that, but also it isn't his story. It's another story. But there are a lot of kind of elements of necessity involved. So the kids are there because they're always around. They can be used. Like none of them want to be actors, but they're happy to help dad out. I think he explained that when we spoke to him, that Ida had no designs on being an actress, but she was happy to help dad out. And I think actually with her, it's funny because she's very much into horse riding. And in Godland, she gets to play with a horse. In this film, there's like the tiniest moment where she gets a horse, or where Granddad finds a horse and forces Magnus to buy it for her. which is quite funny. Shout out to Ingvar Sigurdsson, who makes an
Surprise,
appearance.
surprise.
Yeah. But there's that idea of necessity. So the kids are there, and also the fact that Palmerston's just filming stuff. He can use that however he likes. I think that's part of what makes the story less narrative driven, is that he's sort of building a patchwork of stuff.
Patchwork is a really good expression, actually, because sometimes I was like, okay, so if it's patchwork, you know, I was questioning some of the squares in the patchwork and like what they're adding to the overall picture.
Sure.
There were certain moments where I was thinking, what are you telling us with this, or what are you saying? You know, certain shots that we have maybe of like fish, or obviously a lot of it's kind of also about the surroundings and stuff, and that's part of the picture, but some of it did feel a bit abstracted from the themes or the narrative.
Yeah, I think there's a propensity to just showing images because they're quite visually striking.
Yeah,
And the film,
exactly.
it does look fantastic. Again, it's shot in his classic way with the 35mm camera in Academy ratio, so it's the box format, and it looks gorgeous. And these shots, like the kids, the twins with the fish is a specific example. And I'm just thinking out loud here. They're holding a giant fish, okay, but then you see them holding the giant fish again, and it's cut in half. And I guess now thinking about it, that kind of feeds into one of the main themes of the film, which I picked up on, which I think is probably destruction versus creation. This is a film about a family splitting apart, and there are so many images of things breaking, things falling apart, things being destroyed, that maybe those kind of quick images fit in there somehow. I mean, there are a lot of images, but even cutting mushrooms up, maybe just in the nature of cutting them, is a look at destruction. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's very quiet destruction, isn't it? Like, it's very much a kind of conscious uncoupling type of situation.
Are you talking about the mushrooms or the family?
Maybe both.
We should sort of go back to the main point of the film, I guess, before we carry on, is that Maggie no longer lives at home, and we don't know what's happened, but he's away on this fishing vessel most of the time. He doesn't live at home, and it's just kind of seeing how people react to that situation. And it seems like actually it's not that bad for everyone. Everyone's quite frank with each other at all times. The kids talk to each other like quite openly, and for youngsters quite honestly, about sex and their parents having sex and things like that. And then Anna talks to Maggie about the way he wants to raise the children, the way she wants to raise the children. There's obviously a bit of a disparity there. And Maggie's not sure what he's doing, where he fits anymore, I guess.
Yeah, he's definitely adrift. I mean, like, quite literally, we see him floating in the sea adrift.
That's quite that I'd say of all the images, that's one of the quite obvious specific images. Maggie drifting alone in the sea. It's spoiler alert, it's the end of the film. But yeah, I think you're right. He doesn't quite know what to do. And it's comic as well, seeing him just floating there, cursing that ship that was supposed to go and pick him up. And yeah, that slow dissolution, I guess, is in contrast to a lot of the images of destruction that we see, some of which are quite big images of destruction, others are more subtle. But the film opens with a building being destroyed, which actually it turns out is the director's old art studio, which was filmed again because it was happening. So he filmed it and then found a way to use it. So that's another example of it just being a piecemeal process and a personal kind of filming thing. But there's also the mine. So we've got Maggie as a fisherman. And for a while, especially in my first watch of this film, I thought, okay, so he's on a trawler. It's the herring season, so he's a fisherman. And then they just seem to be bringing up all sorts of other stuff out of the sea. And I didn't know what that was or what it meant. And then they find this mine, which is quite comical, actually. And we get one of the guys in the crew talking about the history of mines during the war and how the British copied their designs from the Germans and all of this stuff. And then eventually we see this mine get exploded. And maybe that's symbolic of where we've got to with Anna and Maggie.
Yeah, I feel like maybe I would have liked more of the interpersonal drama, just like writ large, rather than as much kind of metaphorical stuff, imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, to see them interacting a bit more and discussing. So how did you find the scene where they're in the kitchen after dinner?
Yes.
And they're discussing how to
talk to
the kids.
I really enjoyed that scene, and I thought that was one of the kind of most juicy, meaty scenes because it was really addressing the issue head on. I guess it's like, right, it kind of reveals what's at the heart of the drama.
Yeah, which is that butting heads.
Yeah.
Of the parents.
But as interesting as the butting heads is the kind of ways that they would work together, or like the ways that they accommodate each other and are actually kind of get on quite well or help each other as well.
Yeah.
Then you think, oh, maybe there's hope.
Oh, is that what you were thinking?
I wasn't thinking that necessarily, but I guess it's like, it's not as simple as I hate you, I can't stand to be in the same room as you, I'll drop the kids off and, shout at you from the doorstep kind of thing.
It's true,
it's
although
more complex than that.
Anna does at one point say that she'd like to kill Maggie after her arc gets a bit kind of disrupted, shall we say, by the horses. She sits down and says she wishes that someone she hates had left the gate open and that she hates Maggie and wants to kill him. How true is that? The film doesn't sort of show any other reason for her to actually want to kill him. Because like you say, they are accommodating, they are quite amicable. They go on these family trips together.
Exactly. And there's a sense of like longing. So the family trips, one of my favorite bits of it, actually, this sounds weird, but was the shot. So where they're on a family trip and it's kind of springtime, she like walks over he's lying down, she walks over his head and he kind of like sees up her skirt. Sounds like a weird moment, but it's made into this really beautiful moment, and it's kind of like, it's erotic, but it's kind of longing and it's sad almost because obviously they're not together anymore. So there's a lot of feelings going on.
Yeah, I mean, the way I wrote it down, I described it as the artsy upskirt.
Yeah,
it leads into the first of the fantastical moments, doesn't it? Where Maggie's sort of surrounded by that dress. But there's so many feelings involved in that moment. Like, why does she decide to tease him by standing over his head? She knows we've seen that he wants to sleep with her, whether that's from out of love or just being lonely or surrounded by men for weeks on end. Like, what is she thinking? She just want to wind him up?
I think there's a bit of a game of chess going on, isn't there? It feels a bit like they're sparring partners at points.
Sparring partners, yeah. So you think it's just a kind of, this is what you could have had or what you did have, but now you can't.
I think probably, yeah.
Yeah, but interesting to do it on a family trip. The kids were right there. I don't know, but I think it goes to show, specifically that Maggie is wanting something, if not just the comfort of his ex-wife, certainly sex, to put it bluntly. But it's a really nice scene. All the scenes of them as a family going out. If you saw those moments separate from the rest of the film, you'd have no idea that they were a family falling apart, because it feels just so natural and like a solid family unit.
Yeah, which I guess is so often the case, right, with things like divorce and stuff.
I guess if you can get
wouldn't
to
see
that
it from
point,
the outside.
I'm not one to know what that would be like, but it certainly looks. It must be harder than it looks in this film, anyway. I tell you one thing I did like is that it sort of feeds back into that destruction versus creation thing. Like the family's falling apart, but they still find ways to move on and create, and that kind of comes out through these scenes where they're collecting berries, and turns out these are crowberries. They grow everywhere in Iceland. This is a very specific Iceland thing. Grow in the mossy lava fields, so they're everywhere. So they're kind of staple part of a diet, apparently. And they go and make jam from them, and that becomes a family endeavor to create this jam. And it's quite a funny moment where they're all just like absolutely covered in it.
Yeah.
And the kids are just pressing go on the blender and
it does look like a great childhood, doesn't it? Like shooting arrows at things, making art projects out in the fields, and chaos with the jam. It looks good fun.
Yeah, I would say that the parents are doing the right things here. Okay, we'll get to the major misstep, but like the kids seem to be having a great time. And you mentioned there, which is one of the big scenes we should talk about. So let's do that now. But this suit of armor that they suspend on a giant.
So what was your take on this giant thing? A pole,
some sort of pole, yeah,
strapped to a pole. What was your take on this?
What's my take?
Suit of armor. So they create it, shoot arrows into it, and then in a kind of quite creepy, fantastical sequence, it comes to life.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a take. I guess my take is it's just another example of the kids being allowed to get on with stuff. Following in their mum's footsteps, perhaps, because she's the artist and they're creating. We don't really know what Dad's involvement is, other than that they're not to fire arrows without him there. But then, like they say in a very kind of key line, is that, well, Dad's never here, which is quite a telling thing. I think I don't know what it represents, but I guess in that final scene, in that scene near the end where Maggie finds the suit of armor who's woken up, pulled the arrows out of the chest with a giant spurt of blood, which was quite funny, and appears in the house. I think these fantasy scenes are just in Maggie's head.
Yeah, I agree.
From what I can tell. And I guess the suit of armor represents the armor around Anna now that she's left him.
You pulled it off. I was like, where are you going to go here?
I literally just made that up on the spot.
You talked yourself into a corner there, but you came out swinging. I liked it.
I think one of the things that I figured that led me to that is that, according to the credits, the suit of armor, which is named Joan of Arc, and I'll explain that in a second, that one of the people who played the suit of armor was Saga Garðarsdóttir, the actress who plays Anna.
Yeah.
So in that scene, I think it's her, and they kiss. So maybe Maggie's just fantasizing that if he can hang around long enough, he can kind of break down that armor again and get back into the family life, into bed with her. Yeah, something like that. What do you take of it? Because I guess before he gets with her, the kids have killed her.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was a bit baffled by the suit of armor sequence. The other fantastical sequences, I think I could see a bit more what was going on. The giant chicken scene, loved that.
Oh,
because
yeah.
I think that was the first fantastical scene where basically he's lying on a sofa and then the chicken or the rooster, which he's killed,
Uh-huh.
comes back for its revenge and basically boshes him to death. But like it's giant. It's like, 15 foot high or whatever. And again, it's kind of his guilt at having killed the chicken, but it's also his like failure. And, I guess the chicken is just his life getting mangled, isn't it?
Yeah, he killed the chicken. He killed the relationship. It's come back to get its own back. I'm not sure, but it certainly felt like he's been roughed up, messed around, and
Roughed up by a rooster.
it seems like Ida really would have liked to get her own back on her dad, because there's that really interesting scene where they're in the car. She's driving for a start, and then she is explaining how he was the best rooster and literally explaining what chickens are and the pecking order and how they're supposed to behave towards each other, and that dad shouldn't have killed the rooster, and that mum is an artist. What does she know about animals? And the dad sort of starts lying, and then he can't lie, and it's all kind of, the dynamics there are complex, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, she's that brink of adulthood where she's not really a child anymore. So it's finding that balance of where she's realizing that, her parents are fallible. And I mean, she's very much like, you two are idiots, basically, isn't she? And
Yeah.
it's like that balance is being redrawn.
Yeah. And maybe, I don't know, Maggie's not great with female influences in his life. I don't know, but certainly being spoken to like that by your daughter and not having any kind of legs to stand on is
humiliating.
Yeah, humiliating. Poor Maggie. But then I'm saying that we don't know what happened, and I guess you could say poor Anna, but what we see of her is that she's very kind of headstrong. She wants stuff done. She gets stuff done.
I have to say that I think probably my sympathy, maybe it's just because I'm a woman, but my sympathies kind of naturally lent towards Anna over Maggie. Like I got the impression that Maggie was probably a bit useless.
Again, it's all spurious. We don't know, but he does sort of, I would agree, he does sort of come across as useless, certainly in the car scene.
She's quite proactive getting stuff done, isn't she?
She is, but I guess the key here is that he's the breadwinner or the fish winner, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
He's the one who goes out working. He's the one who can afford the horse with Grandpa. For Ida, he's the one who puts food on the table ultimately, because while Anna is doing what she wants to do, she's unable to actually make money from it, from what we can see.
Yeah.
She's using, I think it's her brother August is the one fabricating all those sheets of metal for her to use in her art. But she doesn't ever on screen get anywhere with that art. It's really interesting because that method of creating art sort of feeds into the destruction creation thing again, in that she's letting the metal rust.
Destruction is creation.
Yeah,
oh my
there
God,
we are.
Deep.
But the director has been making art like that for years. So there's another sort of biographical thing featuring. But I think the big scene for Anna that kind of explains her whole kind of where she's at the moment is when the Swedish gallery owner turns up. And this could be the turning point for her, finding an audience and getting her artworks out there and selling them. But
he's insufferable. It was very well depicted actually, but of the most kind of like slimy, annoying man. And then in the final moment when he leaves and he gets on the plane and he's stolen the egg, It was like such an evil moment.
It was such a comic villain
Yeah.
moment, expecting to have a handlebar moustache and twiddle
Yeah,
it
exactly.
kind of thing. What a prick.
Yeah.
Like, why would you travel all the way to Iceland from Sweden just to talk at an artist about, what was he even talking about? How wine...
Yeah.
Although it did remind me of that amazing film, the Danish film Another Round, which is fantastic if you haven't seen that.
I've not.
But he talks at her, he talks about other artists, and he just completely... He doesn't even know that she's not painting.
He's not
I
interested,
mean-
is he? He's very he's very kind of like self-important. I wonder if the director had a axe to grind against some, art scene types with that portrayal.
Yeah, I reckon so. There's got to be something there, hasn't there? So he's met enough gallery owners in the past,
Yeah.
for sure. But yeah, I guess it's comic, but it's also tragic. And again, it's probably a comment on men.
If in doubt, it's a comment on men.
Men are shits, aren't they?
Anna, I want to be honest with you. I have no space with the gallery at this point. In fact, I have too many artists who aren't getting enough exposure or attention. But believe me when I say, I know you will find someone. It's just a matter of time. And if you don't find the right gallery will find you, okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.
No. Thank you for coming and taking the time.
My pleasure. Bye. Herregud. Tell my mother I love her.
I think we've touched on most of the kind of big points of the film. It is lots of things. How does that result in this kind of... It's not the denouement, but it is certainly the start of the end, when one of the boys ends up with an arrow in his chest.
Again, this is kind of a comedic moment, isn't it? I guess
It
for
is.
me, what do I take from that? Is it that the parents have been kind of so involved in their own stuff that they haven't paid attention to the kids, and then this is like very literally what's happened from it? Or is it just another kind of scene of the kids running wild and doing their own family, and just part of this kind of bigger portrayal of the family dynamic? What do you think? It's played quite comedically. I was never concerned that, oh my God, he's gonna die.
No, for sure. It reminded me of that moment in Nest that made us, I think, both gasp
Oh yeah,
when the kid falls from the tree. I haven't checked if it's the same one. Of
probably the
twins.
same one.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a sort of comment on, actually, both parents are equally responsible for the kids, and neither of them were there.
Yeah,
But actually, Magnus, he's away working. His reason is legit, I guess.
yeah,
Where is Anna at this point?
probably doing her art.
I don't know. Someone should be making sure they're okay. But she does take him to the hospital. And I think that whole scene is just so well played, because it's not like it's not overly dramatic, it's not overly comic, but the sort of tension builds, and the kid's like, I can't feel anything, and that kind of gives you this certain atmosphere. But the second that the doctor starts cutting into his jumper and he notices it, can start to feel it, that scream.
Yeah,
Oh
do you
my
know?
God.
I thought the second they were shooting those arrows, I was like, this is a recipe for disaster. Somebody's gonna get shot here. And I
You
was
did?
right.
You predicted it.
Well, in my head, yeah, I did.
Fair play. I hadn't crossed my mind, actually. Shows how
Really?
good of a parent I am.
I was gonna say this must be just the new mother in me. I'm alert to dangers on all
There we are.
fronts.
Yeah, maybe Anna's outgrown that.
Yeah.
But yes, very comical, very different to moments in Godland and A White
Yeah.
White Day, for sure.
Hérna. Alveg eins og það á að vera, vinur.
So yeah, so that's the reason that Maggie decides he needs to get home. He wants to make sure his kid's all right. So he does care about his kids.
Oh, yeah.
So much so that he's willing to just jump in the ocean and wait for another ship to take him back to shore.
Is that what he was doing? I was like, is he just basically giving up and just kind of doing a slow suicide?
No, he's supposed to be getting picked up by this other ship, the Joni or something.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and it never comes. And that's who he's cursing at the end. But then he curses himself and all of that kind of...
So what do you think
essentially
about
is
the
awful.
ending then? Is he just left to freeze to death in the Icelandic Ocean? Does he make the boat back? What do you think?
I don't think he's going to die in the sea. I think it's a nice way to end the film with him floating there. And it gives us a chance to think about how he might change things, maybe be at home a bit more, or maybe it's just that he should cut himself free from Anna and find his own way, because he's definitely currently just adrift. Oh, beautiful. Well done, Cleaner. So yeah, I think he cares for his family, and I think that the film ends, while it's a sort of comic and potentially tragic moment, I think actually it's a bit more subtle than that, and it's to do with the want and the need to be with his family. There is love that remains in his heart.
It's always a good podcast when you can include the name of the film you're talking about in conversation.
I think Kermit O'May used to say, if you hear the title of the film in the film, then it's time to walk
Bingo.
out. But please don't stop listening just yet. We've got a couple more minutes to go. Okay, so that's the film, and it's very different. You said you weren't sure about it. How does it rank to you next to the others that we've covered on this podcast of his?
So A White White Day and Godland.
Yeah.
Well, Godland I really especially loved, and I actually really enjoyed White White Day as well. So I would say this is not up there with them for me, just because, I mean, it might also be because I'm in a headspace where I need a bit more hand-holding and a bit more stuff spelling out for me. It was a bit too much like an art piece and not enough of a narrative film for me. But
I get that.
But obviously it's still incredibly beautiful, and the themes, they do come through, and there's some incredibly striking visuals and sequences in it. But just as overall, it didn't kind of hit home in the way that those of the two did. It didn't have the emotional heft for me.
Yeah, I totally get that. I think it definitely feels more of an art house film than the other two. And the director does do short films that could sit in galleries. So I mentioned Joan of Arc before, which is what they've ended up calling The Suit of Armour. So the sort of genesis of that is that the kids started doing that, and he was filming the whole thing in the same way of Nest over the course of however long. And that has been turned into a 60-minute film, art installation piece, similar in nature to Nest.
See, yeah, it feels more like a kind of curated collection of interesting things that he's encountered, rather than he came with a really strong idea and filmed it through it. It feels more like he was like, oh, that's kind of cool, and this over here is kind of cool. We could put them all together and that could be a film.
Yeah, and I think that's basically what happened, and I agree that it doesn't hold together in quite the same way as his previous films, even though there were elements of the same kind of production process with those. And there was a script for this film before they did principal photography, I guess. But yeah, I think I agree with everything you've said. I liked it. I liked the way it looked. I enjoyed the soundtrack, very different from his previous films, keeping the tone lighter than we've had before. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, we can't not talk about this dog, Okay.
What do you have to say about this dog?
What do I have to say about this dog? It's a cute dog, right?
Okay.
But the main thing that came out of this is, so this film was at Cannes in 2025. It was submitted as Iceland's entry for the Oscars in 2026. I don't think it made it to the shortlist in the end. But speaking of Cannes, it didn't win any awards as far as I know, except for the Palm Dog. So
Amazing.
yes. So there is an award run, I don't know if it's through
Surely not an official Cannes award.
I don't think it's an official award, but it's certainly a big deal out there. Like, it runs every year and has done for like 20 odd years. So Panda, the name of the dog, also in the film, won the Palm Dog.
Well done, Panda.
And I don't know, did you see the film Anatomy of a Fool a couple of years ago?
Oh yeah, big deserve for that.
Great dog in that. Hey, he won the Palm Dog too. Messi, I believe his name was. But this is the fact that I wanted to get to, is that this isn't even the first Icelandic dog called Panda who was nominated for a Palm Dog.
What?
Yeah, I know.
Why Panda?
Sorry?
Why the name Panda?
Well, there's another thing that I got into a whole separate
You've
sidebar.
really been down some rabbit holes.
Yeah, rabbit holes. Panda, I think, is quite common as a name for a dog in Iceland because of the black and white features. I once stayed at the hostel in Vík, down in the south of Iceland. Their dog was called Panda. It wasn't an Icelandic sheepdog, but it was black and white. So it makes sense. But the dog in the film Lamb, which we covered, he was called Panda, or she was called Panda. And it did not win the Palm Dog, but it won the grand jury prize of the Palm Dog in 2021. Yeah, there's separate awards for the Palm Dog, which I don't quite understand. But yeah, isn't that amazing? 2 dogs called Panda from Icelandic films nominated for this one dog award.
It's very impressive.
Yeah. I mean, if there's any takeaway for this film, it's that Panda is a popular Icelandic dog name. Certainly if you're going to submit it for the award at Cannes.
Well, for me, the takeaway is that there is an award called the Palm Dog. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just assumed you knew that was a thing. Okay, well, fair enough. So there you go. The Love That Remains. And like I said, it's going to be out in the UK on March the 13th, which is incredibly exciting. It's been a whole year since we've had a new Icelandic film to enjoy, and a little bit longer for one that's even been at the cinema. So I thought I'd do a PSA here. So if you are listening to this after March 2026, you can probably jump ahead 30 seconds. But from my research, here we go. I've got a little list of places that it's going to be on and some dates. So start with our favourite local cinema, Bristol Watershed.
Woohoo! We love the Watershed.
Good job, Watershed. It's on from March the 13th to March the 19th. If you see it enough, it might get extended. I think this applies to all of these that I'm going to say. So I'll rattle through them now. The Queen's Film Theatre in Belfast between the 20th and 26th. The Warwick Arts Centre between the same dates. The Tyneside Cinema on the 18th of March. London Garden Cinema, March 13th to the 19th. Home in Manchester from March 13th. The London Lexi, March 27th to the 31st. Plymouth Arts Cinema, same dates. Dundee Contemporary Arts, same dates. Edinburgh Film House and Film Theatre Glasgow from March the 13th. So I think that's, apart from Wales, that's all of the UK covered. And I'm sure if you're listening, Chapter in Cardiff, you'll be showing it soon too. It's very exciting. So hopefully you'll be able to go out, watch this, come back. And this is a weird thing to say when we're recording it in advance, and you might be listening to it in advance, but you can listen to the podcast again, having seen the film. And
let us know what you think.
Please do. We are on the socials at Kvikmyndapod. That's KVIKMYNDAPOD. Did I spell that right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yes, so please get in touch, and we will speak to you all soon. Thanks again, Ellie. Your brain made it through, and you made some fantastic points.
just about. And now it's time to go back to Bridgerton and some mindless, numbing nonsense.
Enjoy. On that bombshell, thanks again for listening. Please do let us know what you thought of Hlynur Pálmasson's The Love That Remains. And don't forget that we have 7 series worth of episodes covering a range of Icelandic films for you to enjoy. So dip back in wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back again soon. See you then. Takk og bless. Thanks and goodbye.